Joining me now for an exclusive interview to talk about the rise in racial tension across America following the acquittal of George Zimmerman is the NAACP's Washington Bureau Director and Senior Vice President for Advocacy, Hillary Shelton. Hillary, thank you for being here.
Oh, it's my honor. Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it. All right, you don't like the verdict. Am I right on that?
No, not at all. We think it's wrong. Quite frankly, if you look at the facts, we know there's some real problems in how this case came out. First, we're looking at a very faulty self-defense policy in the state of Florida, one that allows someone to be stalked, assaulted, and then shoot someone to death, even if they're unarmed, and get away with it. That's a major problem in America. It's a problem in those laws in Florida. Even if we know, if even Stand Your Ground had been added, Stand Your Ground is a policy that's actually led to, over the last 5 years, an increase in so-called self-defense homicides by over 300%. There's a real problem in our country moving towards the old Wild Wild West policies in which someone must shoot first to be able to survive through the day.
You say stalked and assaulted as though that was a fact. First of all, George Zimmerman's a neighbor.
That is absolutely a fact, Sean. It's absolutely a fact.
Well, it wasn't facts presented in the case. I followed this very closely. The facts of the case are George Zimmerman's a community watch guy. Is it not? If he sees somebody, if you see somebody in your own neighborhood you don't recognize, would you call the police?
Well, let's talk about community watch. Number one,
that's not what I asked
community watch policies coming out of the Justice Department. The NAACP worked very closely in the 1990s when we had a major problem with crime across the country to get community organizations involved in providing greater protection in our neighborhoods. Those policies included 2 points that George Zimmerman seems to totally ignore. Number one, community watch are not supposed to engage in trying to stop crimes from happening, but simply to report them to the police. Number two, community watch are never supposed to be armed at all, but that's what happened in this case. In essence, if he was a community watch captain, he clearly had not read the policies or ignored them altogether.
Hillary, it's not illegal to get out of your car if you see somebody suspicious. The gun he had was legal, and I'll read to you from I'll read to you from the justifiable use of deadly force and the instructions to the jury.
In the state of Florida, I hope. Good.
And the state of Florida. If George Zimmerman was not engaged in an unlawful activity, and he was not, and he was attacked in any place where he had a right to be, he was punched in the face and then ground and pound, he had no duty to retreat and had the right to stand his ground and meet force with force, including deadly force, if he thought it was necessary to prevent death and great bodily harm to himself or another. Now, that's the law of Florida, whether you like it or not, that's the law.
That's the law. Let's take a couple steps back. You said earlier in the show that very well you know that George Zimmerman had been watching Trayvon Martin. He'd been stalking him. He got in his car and started. Is it not stalking? Is stalking not when you're following someone around?
No.
He called into the police as he was following him around.
And they said, where is he now? They encouraged him to look.
And he told him. And the police said, thanks, we got it. We're sending out a cruiser. Because the police know that the policies for community watch groups are not to intervene. But everyone knows that Mr. Zimmerman intervened. As a matter of fact, if you look at the testimony of Trayvon Martin's girlfriend, she said very clearly that she heard Mr. Zimmerman saying, "Who are you? What are you doing here?"
Wait. She also said today, this is important. She also said that she believes that Trayvon punched him first and initiated the contact.
Now, let me ask you this. If Trayvon Martin is walking along the way, and if Mr. Zimmerman came in and stood in front of him to stop him, most likely he'd probably put his hands up to say stop. Because he said, wait, who are you? What are you doing here? Well, let me say this. If we're only going to go on the guy that shot him to death's testimony, we have a real problem.
But here's what you're missing. You're forgetting one thing.
You are not putting together the story that came out.
I'm looking at the evidence, and the jury agreed with me.
Well, help walk through. The jury decided on very narrow facts how the outcome of this case should come out. Now, the jury was not told to think about the fact that he was being followed. The jury was not told to consider the fact that indeed.
There's no denying that.
Oh. The jury talked about.
Here's what you're missing, though. You're missing an important fact. Let me help you out here.
I'd love to hear this fact, Sean. Share with me.
All right, I'm going to help share with you because I think it was a terrible tragedy. Hillary,
absolutely.
I think this was a misunderstanding.
There's not a father in America that is not scared to death of what's just happened here for our children.
But what I think you're missing, let me get this in. What I think you're missing here is is that George Zimmerman had a right to be there. That gun was legal.
Yes, he did.
And
but
Trayvon,
he did not have a
hang
right.
on,
He
let me
did
finish
not
my
have
thought.
a right. He did not have a right to intervene with Trayvon Martin.
Wait a minute.
He did not have that right to put his hands on him.
But there's no evidence to support that. We know that Trayvon Martin punched him and broke his nose, and the eyewitness, the one eyewitness in the case, hang on, the one eyewitness in the case has Trayvon bam, straddling MMA ground and pound.
Now,
why do you ignore that like Congressman Rush?
I'm not ignoring that, but I'm also not ignoring what happened as we moved to that point. As we moved to that point, at what point did George Zimmerman intervene with Trayvon Martin? At what point?
All right, let me ask another question. We've got to move on.
No.
Right,
Help me with this.
I'll
At
help
what
you.
point when he walked up did he intervene with Trayvon Martin?
Well,
At what point?
Listen,
do you believe
we will never
do you
know.
believe that,
Here's the
that
answer.
based on
Wait
the
a minute.
conversation,
You don't know the answer,
based on
and
the
I don't know the-
conversation,
You asked me a
based on the
question, go ahead, answer.
conversation with the girlfriend said she overheard
You're like Chris Matthews.
George Zimmerman's voice. Thank you so much. Overheard George Zimmerman's voice asking Trayvon, "Who are you? What are you doing here?"
But that same woman, but you're not listening to this part. You asked me a question and answer the question.
Go ahead and say it, please.
That same woman said yesterday that she believes that Trayvon initiated the fight. Now, here's the problem.
Oh, she did not
George
say that.
Zimmerman screaming at the top of
She
his
did not
lungs
say
with a
that.
broken nose and an eyewitness putting Trayvon, beating the crap out of him. The question then becomes what the law of Florida is. I think it's a terrible tragedy. But here's the point. You don't like the verdict, so now you want to pressure the president and Eric Holder to go after civil rights violations. As far as I'm concerned, that sounds like people that disagree with the verdict are being sore losers and now want to make this guy's life a living hell.
Let me say this. We got 1.5 million and growing emails from across the country of other people that have real problems with their assessment of the evidence and how it was applied in this particular case. I hear what you're saying.
Out of 300
and
million
I understand
people.
very well. That you and I both heard the one member of the jury. Sure, thank you.
All right.
Go right
There
ahead.
were 61 deaths in Chicago.
Yes.
61
It's sad.
deaths during just the time of the Zimmerman trial. Can you name one person by name that died in Chicago?
I cannot. But I can tell you this.
Doesn't that tell you why? Because I don't want to see kids dying.
I appreciate this talking point, but let me share something with you.
Not a talking point.
Share with me one case of someone being shot to death in Chicago in which, if the perpetrator was actually apprehended, they were not fully prosecuted.
Well, what I'm trying to ask you is why does the NAACP focus on this and not focus on? Look how black-on-black crime that is now an epidemic in Chicago. And here a jury acquitted this man, and you guys want to go after him. You don't like the verdict. Why not focus on Chicago?
Sean, I wish you remember the NAACP and knew as much about us as you think you do. Quite frankly, the NAACP has been going after the issue of the murder of African-American children from the very beginning.
You don't know the name of one of them.
Let me share something with you. I happen to know that of African-American children between 15 and 19, gun violence is the #1 cause of death. Will you support gun control legislation to help end that awful violence?
No.
And if you go back and look at the gun control legislation that was passed in 1994, you probably know that the homicide gun-related rate went down as a result of us actually eliminating the use of assault weapons. But you're not going to support that.
No.
Let's talk about what works instead of some
I think law-abiding citizens have a right to protect themselves. But listen, we'll invite you back, and we'll get into a deeper discussion.
African-American children utilizing racial profiling
We'll get into a deeper
tactics.
discussion when we have you back.
Even Mr. Zimmerman said that very well he was looking for a black person because he heard black people were burgling houses in his neighborhood.
That's not
true.
He did. He never said that.
The word got out. Listen, when they asked him why
that's not true. You're making that up.
The word was out that some African-Americans had robbed a couple houses. And that's what he was looking for.
It was a fact
and that's
in the
how he
neighborhood.
profiled him.
It was a fact.
Oh, go back and look at it.
Is he black, white, or Hispanic? He was asked that question.
You should listen to the entire set of evidence around this case.
Coming up next.
That might be helpful.